Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Parīkṣit said, one may know that sinful activity is injurious for him because he actually sees that the criminal is punished by the government and rebuked by people in general. And because he hears from scriptures and learned scholars that one is thrown into hellish conditions in the next life for committing sinful acts. Nevertheless, in spite of such knowledge, one is forced to commit sins again and again, even after performing acts of atonement. Therefore, what is the value of such atonement? Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. In some religious sect, a sinful man goes to a priest to confess a sinful act and pay a fine, but then he again commits the same sin and returns to confess them again. This is the practice of a professional sinner. Parīkṣit Mahārāja's observations indicate that even 5,000 years ago, it was the practice of criminals to atone for their crimes, but then commit the same crimes again as if forced to do so. Therefore, owing to his practical experience, Parīkṣit Mahārāja saw that the process of repeatedly sinning and atoning is pointless. Regardless of how many times he is punished, one who is attached to sense enjoyment will commit sinful acts again and again until he is trained to refrain from enjoying his senses. The word vivaśaḥ is used here indicating that even one who does not want to commit sinful acts will be forced to do so by habit. Parīkṣit Mahārāja therefore considered the process of atonement to have little value for saving one from sinful acts. In the following verse he further explains his rejection of this process. For the last several days we have been discussing atonement, that there are different types of atonement, but the conclusion of all the Vedic scriptures is that the atonement by the processes of jnana kanda or karma kanda is not complete because the roots of performing simple activities remain within the heart. So Parīkṣit Mahārāja is actually making the same point in a different manner again. He says, so what is the use of this type of atonement? What's the use of this atonement if it doesn't take the root away? And as explained, the root can only be taken away if the senses are engaged by the process of devotional service in the service of the Lord. A question arises, why is one compelled to commit sinful activities? Isn't it? Because over here the point is being made that even after going through the process of atonement, the living entity again commits sinful activities. So in the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna questioned Krishna. So why is the living entity compelled to commit sinful activities? And Lord Krishna replied that it is lust only which is the all-devouring enemy of the living entity. So it is this lust only which is the enemy of the living entity. And this lust later on is transferred into wrath, into anger. So as long as one is unable to conquer over this lust, the living entity will go on sinning. So Arjuna's question was, why is one compelled to perform sinful activities even if he doesn't desire to commit it? At times the living entity may not desire to commit sinful activities. He wants to be good. But because he does not have control over his senses, because he is a victim of lust, therefore he is forced to fulfill the different desires of the senses. So the point is that one who wants to really atone, he must be in full control of the process of attraction and repulsion. That is also stated in the 3rd chapter of the Gita. Lord Krishna advises Arjuna, the attraction and repulsion are there, but they are impediments on the for the spiritual advancement of one who is not able to control them. So the transcendentalist, he is in full control over his senses, and as a result, the attraction and repulsion does not bother him. The transcendentalist is advised to be a dhira. That is, he is supposed to be equiposed in all situations. So, if one is equiposed in all situations, then one can conquer over this lust. In the 3rd chapter, Krishna very vividly explains the position of our enemy, where the enemy is located. Avatam jnana itena jnanino nitya varina kama rupena kaunteya. Kama means this lust. This lust is covering our intelligence. This lust is covering our intelligence. In the Bhagavad Gita it is explained that higher than the dull matter are the senses. Then higher than the senses is the mind. Higher than the mind is the intelligence. And higher than the intelligence is the soul. In the Katham, the soul is described to be the topmost. So the higher than the senses is the mind and then the intelligence. So one must control these senses with the help of the mind and the intelligence. And then in the 40th verse of the 3rd chapter, Krishna specifically identifies where this enemy is located. Krishna has identified where is the enemy. So what is the principal enemy? That is this lust, which is the all-devouring enemy of the living entity and which has covered the intelligence of the living entity. In the Prema Vivaśaḥ, Krishna has said, Krishna bhai murka na bhoga vancha kare nikatastha maya kare japatya dhare. That is, as soon as the living entity develops the desire to enjoy independent of Krishna or like Krishna, he is at once sent down into this material world. So Krishna in the 3rd chapter is also identifying where is this enemy situated. It is not that he just tells us, oh, lust is your enemy. But then he goes on to say, Indriyani mano buddhir. This lust is situated in Indriyani. Indriyani means the senses. Mano means the mind. Buddhir. Asyatitam. This lust is situated in the mind, intelligence, and the senses, and through these outposts, it is manifesting itself. Just like Prabhupada explained in the purport of this verse, Krishna has identified the strategic positions which the enemy is occupying. Prabhupada explains that when you're fighting a battle, the first thing you want to know, where is the enemy situated? These days they have so many spy planes that just travel around to just try and identify what are the enemy's positions, what are his strong points. So similarly, Krishna has done that research for us. Vyasadeva has done that research for us. And Vyasadeva is pointing out that this enemy is situated in the mind, intelligence, and the senses. So the enemy is manifesting itself through the senses, mind, intelligence. And Krishna further says, the living entity is covered by different degrees of lust. And a very beautiful analogy is given of that fire that is covered by smoke, or a mirror that is covered by dust, or as the womb that is covered by the embryo. So the living entity is covered by different degrees of lust, and till he cannot transform this into love, the living entity continues to sin. So one may atone, but that atonement will not be complete because the living entity has not transformed his lust into love. The origin of lust is identified in the Bhagavatam. Janma dasa yito nayat apiratas. That is, everything is taking janma, birth, from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Everything actually is coming from God. This is confirmed in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Janma dasa yito nayat. So, ita ratta satesha abhijana swarat. Everything is coming from that entity who is completely independent. So, the origin of lust is also the Supreme Lord. But that lust has to be transformed into love. Lust and love do not mean the same. In the material world, everybody talks about love, but actually it is lust only. Love can only be for the Supreme Lord. Prabhupada once gave an example that even in this material world, if at all there is some love, that is only between the mother and the child, but even that is not pure love. So, unless lust is transformed into love, the living entity will be forced to go on committing sinful activities one after another. So the process of devotional service to the Lord is to transform this lust into love. Love for the Supreme Lord. The nature of this lust is that it can never be satisfied. In the Gita, it is explained that just like the criminal is handcuffed, similarly, the living entity is handcuffed, is in the shackles of sex life. This is known as Naitunya Agara. The living entity, because he has a very, very strong attraction for sex life, he is completely entangled in the material world. Because as long as this desire is there, as long as he is not free from the shackles of sex life, the living entity will never be really able to understand how he can establish his relationship with the Lord, how he can render the pure devotional service to the Supreme Lord. In the Bhagavatam, two words have been explained, jnana and vijnana. Jnana means knowledge of the self. Knowledge of the self, that the self is different from the body, that is composed of different material elements. And vijnana means knowledge of one's constitutional position, that he is eternally a part and parcel of God. Mamevamsa jiva loka jiva bhuta sanatana. That every living entity is the eternal part and parcel of the Lord. So jnanam and vijnanam. So one who wants to render devotional service, he must understand the meaning of jnanam, and he must also understand the meaning of vijnanam. So, in order to succeed on the path of devotional service, or in order to not sin and atone, this is exactly what Parīkṣit Mahārāja is getting at. He is saying, how can this stop this sinning and atoning business? And in the purport, Prabhupada talks about professional atoners. These are people who just go, pay a fine, pay a penalty for the sins that they perform, and then again resume the sins, thinking that these sins will be cancelled. These are called professional atoners. So Parīkṣit Mahārāja is personally questioning, how can this stop? So the answer is given in the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, how this can be stopped. This can only be stopped if the living entity can transform the lusty propensity into love for the Lord. Because of his contact with material nature, that loving propensity has been transformed into lust, just like milk. Milk, when it comes in touch with sour tamarind, it becomes yogurt. So just like milk that is touched with a sour tamarind becomes yogurt. Similarly, the living entity, when he comes in contact with the material nature, the loving propensity gets transformed into lust. And then, instead of lovingly serving the personality of Godhead, which is the constitutional position of the living entity, he becomes a slave of his senses. And then from morning to night, he just works towards fulfilling these different desires of the senses. So, the Gita explains that the nature of this lust is that it can never be satisfied. And this has been very nicely explained in the Srimad Bhagavatam in the story of King Yayati. The story of King Yayati is very well known. In brief it is, that King Yayati was very attached to sex life. He had a very beautiful young wife and nice children, but still he was very attached to sex life, and once he had an affair with one of his wife's maidservants. He was then cursed by his father-in-law to take on the body of an old man, but at the same time he was told that if he could find somebody who would be willing to exchange his youth for old age, King Yayati could once again become a young man. So King Yayati approached his eldest son, requesting if he would be willing to change his youth for old age, and the eldest son refused, saying that, no, it's time for me to enjoy. Then he went to the second son. He also refused. Then he went to the third son. He also refused. But then the youngest son agreed to exchange his youth for old age, and then King Yayati once again resumed his sense gratification. But after having engaged in the sense gratification for a very extended period of time with his wife, they both came to the realization that they are still unsatisfied. And King Yayati said, I was just like a lusty goat. I was thinking that I would get satisfaction, but actually there was no satisfaction at all. And then King Yayati and his wife withdrew to the mountains and engaged in the process of meditation. So the point is, through this story of King Yayati, we can understand that these lusty desires can never be satisfied. There are some transcendentalists who think that first we should satisfy our lusty desires. Actually, these are not transcendentalists, but so-called transcendentalists who are passing on in Kali Yuga as transcendentalists. They believe that one should satisfy his lusty desires completely, and then one will be free from these desires and be able to concentrate on service to the Lord. That is not what the scriptures recommend. The scriptures say that devotional service, if it is taken independent of these scriptures, then it will simply create a disturbance in society. Shruti smriti pranadi pancharatra vedam vina ekantiri hari bhakti uttata eva kalpate. Rupa Goswami has specifically warned that if devotional service is independent of Shruti and Smriti, this is simply a disturbance to society. So the point is that these lusty desires of the living entity can never be satisfied. The original position of the living entity is to love God, but because the living entity has come in contact with material existence consisting of the three modes, this loving propensity has been transformed into lust. So now what is the solution? The solution is that one is in material existence, he still has to act in such a way that the material existence is not allowed to touch him. The example is brighter on a lotus flower. It is in water, but it doesn't touch the water. There's a Bengali saying that a man goes fishing and the expert man doesn't touch the water. So we have to live in this material world, but at the same time not be affected by it. Otherwise, one will not be able to develop what is known as love of God. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, there's a nice dialogue between Narada Muni and one of the kings in the 4th canto, Prachina Barisa. So Narada Muni told the king, why are you engaging in fruitive activities? This king had performed even a lot of animal sacrifices. So Narada Muni told him, why are you engaging in unnecessary animal sacrifice? These animals are just waiting for you to leave this body, and then they are all going to eat you. And Narada Muni was advising, please give up fruitive activity. There's a great Vaishnava poet who has compared materialistic life to be like a drop of water in the desert. When a living entity is in the desert, he doesn't need a drop of water for survival. He needs a lot of water for survival. So similarly, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is described to be full of happiness. And the living entity, being his part and parcel, is also entitled to the happiness. The word Krishna has several meanings. And one of the meanings of the word Krishna is reservoir of pleasure. So Krishna is the source of unlimited pleasure. And the nature of this reservoir is completely transcendental, which means that it never gets exhausted. In the material world, there are also reservoirs. Some parts of the world, you can say there's reservoirs of oil. In some parts of the world, they can say there are reservoirs of water. But all these reservoirs have a limit. There are projections when the oil will get exhausted. There are projections when the water reservoirs will get exhausted. But Krishna is different. Anandamaya his reservoir can never get exhausted. So the point is that the great Vaishnava poet has said, material life is like a drop of water in the desert. So in the desert we need a lot of water. The material life may give a little bit of happiness, but that happiness actually is very short-lived. It can end at any moment. So the intelligent being is one who does not take a path that will only give him a drop of water in the desert, but he takes a path that will give him unlimited water in the desert. And that is the path of devotional service. So Narada Muni was advising the king that to engage in fruitive activities or to engage in sense gratification, that is not very healthy. And then, to explain this, Narada Muni related the story of King Puranjan. Actually, we are all Puranjans. Puranjan means one who is the owner of the body. So we are all the owners of this body. We are all the kings of this body. Now what does it mean to be king of this body? It means that the living entity has a free choice. He has a free choice that he can use his body and senses correctly, or he can use it incorrectly. So Narada Muni explained the story of King Puranjan, how this king was so attached to sex life and how he engaged in unlimited sense enjoyment and how he suffered. And then Narada Muni explains how the living entity, if he goes on with this type of sense enjoyment, how he obtains different types of body. Yesterday we had discussed 4 different sources of birth. So the different types of entities that take birth due to the performance of different sinful activities. Narada Muni describes some to be one-legged, some to be two-legged, some to be three-legged, some to be four-legged, some to be many-legged, and some to be without any legs at all. For example, the ghost. The ghost is described to be a one-legged animal, one-legged, because the ghost only has one leg. The ghost cannot really walk like a normal being. The ghost is an example of one-legged entity. Then you have the human beings who are two-legged. But a human being is also described to be three-legged. Does anyone know in what situation? Yeah. So when a human being gets old, he becomes three-legged. Then, because he has to use a cane to walk. When you become old, you can use a cane, and everyone's bound to become old. So then when you make the use of a cane, you get transformed from two-legged to three-legged. And then there are the four-legged, that's the animals. Then there are some aquatics that are with more than 4 legs. And then there are those who do not have any legs at all, namely the snake. So Narada Muni says that if one performs sinful activities or one performs fruitive activities, then he is bound to take birth in one of these different forms of life. So Nādamuni concludes his whole instruction by saying that it is only devotional service to the personality of Godhead that can satisfy the living entity. Parīkṣit Mahārāja's question also is, how can the living entity be made to stop sinning and atoning? So that is only possible if this propensity of lust is transformed into love for the personality of Godhead. If the living entity engages in the process of devotional service, if the living entity is a victim of the senses, then he is going to get trapped to death, just like the different animals are trapped to death. In the fourth canto, the examples are given of the different animals who become a victim of one of their senses and by this process get trapped to death. Like the deer, for example. The deer is very fond of music. So the hunter, he plays a particular melody. The deer gets pulled in that direction and gets trapped to death. Then there's a fish, very fond of eating. It goes towards the bait and gets trapped to death. Then there's the elephant, a very powerful animal, very huge, very big, difficult to capture. But the he-elephant is made to follow the she-elephant. And by this process, he falls in the ditch and he's captured. And then there is the bee, very attracted to finding something palatable to smell. It travels all day, finally finds a lotus flower on which it goes and sits, and by the arrangement of the Lord, in the evening the lotus flower closes, and when the lotus flower closes, the bee gets trapped to death. And then there is the moth that is very, very attracted to seeing light. In the night when it sees the light, it rejoices. This is what I was waiting for. And then it goes towards the light, and it gets burnt by the heat of the light. So, it's just like these different animals, by becoming victims of the different senses, they meet their death. The living entity also, by becoming a victim of these different senses, will get destroyed. So, the human being, the problem with him is that he's trying to satisfy all the senses at the same time. Whereas, in these different animals, there is a trend towards trying to satisfy one sense versus another. There's one sense that is predominating. But in the case of a human being, they are trying to satisfy all the senses at the same time. Therefore, the human life is a very risky business. If it is not utilized correctly, if these lusty propensities, if the dictates of the senses are not controlled, then spiritual advancement becomes very careful, becomes very difficult. So it should never be forgotten that it is lust only which is the greatest enemy of the living entity, and the senses are higher than the dull matter, but higher than the senses there is the mind, higher than the mind there is the intelligence, and higher than the intelligence is the position of the soul. So through the medium of intelligence, we have to control the mind and the senses. The other day we had discussed the mind, how the mind can be one's friend and can also become one's enemy, and how Krishna advises in the Bhagavad Gita that just like a lamp in a windless plate does not waver, similarly the mind should be so controlled that it is completely fixed on the lotus feet of Krishna. Now we are existing in this material world. Our meditation is a spiritual world, just like a tortoise. It is in water, but it is meditating on its eggs that are on land. So similarly, the living entity, the human being, especially when it takes to the path of devotional service, he may be operating in the material world, but the object of his meditation is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna advises that one who has controlled his mind, the super soul is already reached.
So we can see how great it is to control the mind. One who has controlled his mind, the super-soul has already reached. So what does control over the mind mean? Control over the mind means that engaging the mind constantly in thinking of Krishna, engaging the mind in thinking of Krishna's instructions, just like in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna advises, Manmanabhava Madbhakto Madhyajima Namaskuru, always think of me, bow down to me, offer your homage and respects unto me. Or engaging the mind in thinking of how the conditioned souls can be injected with Krishna consciousness. Like Prahlāda Mahārāja was absorbed in thinking. So, if the mind is controlled and engaged in transcendental subject matters, then spiritual progress becomes very, very easy. Parīkṣit Mahārāja gave us the example of how one can utilize all of one's senses in the service of Krishna. Parīkṣit Mahārāja used his eyes to see the beautiful form of the Lord. He used his tongue to vibrate the glories of the Lord. He used his ears to hear the transcendental glories of the Lord. He used his mind to meditate on the Lord. He used his nose to smell incense flowers offered to the Lord. He used his legs to walk to the temple of the Lord. And because he had his mind always fixed on Krishna, this great powerful yogi, Durvasa Muni, who was very proud of his mystic powers, could not cause any harm to him. So, the point is that we must develop a positive attachment for the Lord. That is the only process how one can stop sinning, because if one temporarily suspends sinning, that again is not the solution, because the root is still there in the heart. So the root has to be taken care of. And that is by having a positive engagement taken care of. And that is by having a positive engagement. And that positive engagement is rendering devotional service to the personality of Godhead. Maharaj Rishabhdev was instructing his 100 sons about the business of human life. And Maharaj Rishabhdev, while instructing his 100 sons about the purpose of human life, cautions, do not utilize this life like that of the animals. Naho deyam bhajan loke. Do not utilize this life like the animals. Rather, utilize this human life for cultivating spiritual life. Utilize the human life for cultivating spiritual life. This should never be forgotten. We must engage in tapasya. That is transcendental in nature. Tapo divyam putraka yena sattvam. If one engages in tapasya, that is transcendental in nature, then one can understand the personality of Godhead. One may attempt to understand the personality of Godhead through various mediums, but that will never be successful. This is confirmed in the Padma Purana. Athāsya Krishna Namadina Bhavet Graham Indriyahi Sevo Mukhehi Jivado. That is, the personality of Godhead can only be understood through the process of seva. In the Bhagavad Gita also, we see that Krishna talks about Kama Yoga, he talks about Jnana Yoga, he talks about Sankhya Yoga, but then he concludes by saying, Bhaktya Mam Abhijanante, I can only be known by the path of devotional service. In the Bhagavatam, Lord Kapila describes the Sankhya Yoga philosophy to his mother. Sankhya means to count. So Sankhya Yoga means you maturely analyze the material ingredients, what it is composed of. So he analyzed and he pointed out how this material world is temporary. The material ingredients are there, the material elements are there, but beyond the material elements, there is a spirit soul. Bhūmi rapo nalo vāyu kam manavadi evacha. Krishna explains that there are my 8 separate material elements, but then he says, Apayam itasab anyam taktim badan me param. That is, besides this inferior energy of mind, consisting of the 3 modes,
there is a living entity. So the living entity is superior to the dull matter. The living entity is superior to these material elements. And the living entity, being part and parcel of the Lord, is meant to engage in the process of devotional service. That should be carefully understood. The sense gratification, or pushing the path of sense gratification, this is simply the activity of a madman. Nunam pramata kurute vikarma. Maharaj Rishabdeva specifically concluded that one who pursues the path of sense enjoyment, he actually is just a madman. The intelligent person is one who wants to transform the lusty propensity into love. And the nature of loving Krishna is such that the living entity will be completely satisfied and then he will not want anything else. This was exemplified in the case of Dhruva Maharaj. Dhruva Maharaj had set out for the forest to undergo great austerities because he had a certain goal in mind. He wanted a very opulent kingdom, even more powerful than his fathers and grandfathers. So Dhruva Maharaj performed meditation for a very, very long time. And then, when the Lord was ready to give him, grant his desire, Dhruva refused, because prior to this offer from the Lord had revealed himself to the Dhruva. And Dhruva Maharaj, after seeing the Lord, he was so attracted that he said, I have no desire to acquire that kingdom, because I was looking for broken cut glass, but now I found a diamond. So this devotional service was like a diamond. Devotional service is the most valuable asset that a living entity can possess. Sanatana Goswami was approached by a Brahmin who wanted the touchstone that could convert anything to gold. He gave it to him. And where had he placed that touchstone? He had kept it under the heap of some garbage. And it was only later, when that man, Brahmin, requested him to that he must be having something more valuable than this touchstone, that he gave him this process of chanting the holy names of the Lord. So the point is that the greatest asset that the living entity can possess is the transcendental name of the Lord, the process of devotional service. This is the only thing that can satisfy the living entity. Material life should never be forgotten as exactly like a drop of water in a desert. If you just get a drop of water, your thirst will not be quenched, and you will still remain miserable. There is a story of the Brahman. There was once a very hungry Brahman, and this Brahman searched everywhere for food, but he could not find food. But then he was informed that there is a Mohammedan family nearby that has some food, and if you go to that Muslim family, then he can obtain that food. So the Brahman was hesitating because there's also an injunction that if you eat food from a Muslim's family, then you lose your caste. But the Brahman, he was so hungry and he could not control himself that he finally went to the Mohammedan's house and begged for some food. And he found that food to be completely unpalatable. So he came out in disgust, saying that now I've lost my caste, and at the same time my hunger is still there. So that is exactly the nature of material life. The nature of material life is you lose the opportunity to go back to Godhead, and at the same time you are dissatisfied. Krishna has confirmed this even before attempting material life. He specifically says in the Gita Bhakalayam, everything is full of misery. And why is one not able to enjoy in material life? Because of the time factor. This we discussed briefly yesterday. Krishna says, time I am. So time is acting as a representative of the Supreme Lord. A young man is enjoying, but then due to the time factor he becomes old, and the body begins to give him more pain. One may build a very nice building, but due to the time factor, that building deteriorates. That is another characteristic of this material world. Everything deteriorates after some time. Whereas in the spiritual world, this doesn't happen. So, because of the presence of the time factor, the living entity can never be happy in the material world. Therefore, this material world is called kunta, a place of misery. Therefore, the conclusion of all the Vedic scriptures is that somehow or the other the living entity must establish his relationship with the Lord. Vivaśaḥ samanda abhidaya prayojana. Chaitanya Charitamrita says that the conclusion of all the Vedic scriptures is that somehow or the other we must establish our relationship with the Lord. Because if we establish our relationship with the Lord through the medium of devotional service, then this root will be taken out. This is exactly what Parīkṣit Mahārāja is trying to ask Srila Goswami. He is specifically saying, how can we get rid of this desire to commit sin? So the desire cannot be gotten rid of unless one realizes a higher taste. And when one realizes a higher taste, then everything else appears to be insignificant according to the Bhagavad Gita. So the higher taste is this process of devotional service. So the society is so degraded that it is imitating nothing but animals. Prabhupada used to call this society like the deluxe edition of animals. Just like you have a soft-bound book and a deluxe book. The contents inside are exactly the same, but it's only the covering that varies. The deluxe or the hardbound edition looks more beautiful than the softbound. So similarly, the human being today, he's just like a sophisticated animal, because the materialist who is defying the laws of God is just pushing the path of the animals. The Bhagavatam says that the materialist is doing nothing but imitating the lives of cats, dogs, camels and asses. Just like these different animals are just pursuing their sense gratification process, the human being also is just imitating them, just like the dog. The dog, for example, will serve anyone as long as it gets its food. The dog cannot discriminate what is the character of my master, isn't it? The dog cannot discriminate. The dog thinks that anyone who gives me protection, food, I have to be loyal to him. So similarly, the materialist, he is loyal to anyone who pays him money. Doesn't matter where the money may come from. Doesn't matter what the character of the individual is. As long as he's getting some money, he is satisfied. So that is compared in the Bhagavatam to be like the life of the dog. Then the Bhagavatam compares the materialist to the hog. What is the characteristic of the hog? The hog is just eating dirt and living in dirt. You don't see that so much in this part of the world. But those of you who have gone to India may have seen the hogs in action. The hogs, they live in dirt, they live in stool, they eat stool. If you go to a hog with something clean, palatable, and say, please take this, the hog will reject it. Just like we go in the streets very often with our prasadam, and we tell people, please take this nice food stuff. They'll reject it. Of course, if we tell them it's spiritual food, prasad, then they'll be even more nervous. So even without telling them it's prasad, they're still nervous. But they'll go next to McDonald's and have everything they want. Eat flesh. And this flesh is so unpalatable that in order to eat it, they have to fry it. They have to add some sauce or mayonnaise. Only then it becomes palatable. Then only then it becomes fit for eating. So the materialists today are just like hogs. They're eating without discrimination. And another characteristic of the hog is that it mates without discrimination. So that is happening in society also. Now there is a system of marriage which permits mating on religious principle. The society today doesn't believe in this. They are mating without discrimination as to whether it's wife or not, or what the relationship may be. So this is comparable to the life of the hog. Then the Bhagavatam compares the materialist to the camel. How? The camel draws satisfaction from biting on thorns. The camel thinks that this thorn is very palatable because when he bites on the thorn, actually his tongue bleeds. And he thinks that this thorn is actually giving him nice taste. But actually that taste is because his tongue is being cut by the thorn that he's biting. But he thinks those thorns are very enjoyable. So the materialist also, he thinks that sex life is very enjoyable. This is the shackle by which material energy is keeping the living entity in the material world.
Hare Krishna.